Hey everyone, Carla here again, seeking answers. Speaking with my friend Charles. Hey Charles.
G'day, Carla.
How you doing?
Very well.
Excellent. So I guess look, what I want to know today is, I want to know how did people get infected?
Well, as we've just talked recently about the contamination of the blood supply and the thousands of Australians that ended up with hepatitis C and unfortunately also HIV/AIDS at different times, and how it happened was because I think people had better brace themselves for this. Australia had a contaminated blood supply for decades. Pretty much up until the late 90s, people were, at some level at least, becoming infected with hepatitis from the blood supply. So they knew that the blood supply was contaminating people with hepatitis from, pretty much inception, from the post-war period, from the Second World War. And what happened was in the 1970s, it became clear that there was a type of hepatitis called non-A, non-B hepatitis that was causing damage, liver damage, and causing cirrhosis, and in fact killing people. But what the problem was that this was happening. I think they had studies that said it might be happening 1.7% of the time that you had a blood transfusion or a blood product. There might be this risk that you 1.7% of the time you might end up with something like hepatitis. Now, while that doesn't sound like a lot, think about a country like Australia, who in the 1970s might have had a population, I think, forgive me for being wrong, Carla, but it might have been a bit less than American, a bit less than a place like UK, and only something like 12 million or so. But even so, today is 25 million. But even so, at 1.7% or 1.8%, that translates to being an awful lot of people when you're giving tens of thousands of blood transfusions. So each year, they're giving these blood transfusions out to women who need it after childbirth or for pregnancy complications. You're giving it to accident victims. We've spoken about that previously, the kind of people that would need blood. And you've got haemophiliacs. So what's happened is that they basically left the blood supply unprotected. So they're distributing this blood out in the 1970s. And each time it's going out, it's having this definite risk of transmitting hepatitis. And they didn't do anything about it, and they hardly ever warned anybody about it. And that's why today we've got thousands of Australians who are exposed to hepatitis C through the blood supply.
Right, so did the kind of donors that Australia use play a role in the contamination of our blood supply?
It most certainly did, and it's the biggest factor really in the scandal down here. Australia was using prison blood donors. Now this is going to be a major scandal around the world, what Australia did. And you can see here that in the 1970s, other countries around the world said definitely do not take blood from people in jails, okay? Now why is that important? Okay, well Australia had what we call a voluntary donation system. And so did the United Kingdom, where, of course, they've now got their own blood scandal that's being investigated by this infected blood inquiry in the United Kingdom. But what happened was that if you take blood from prisoners, the problem is that the whole basis of a voluntary donation system, Carla, is that people tell the truth. When Australians donate blood, they do it freely. They do it on the idea that they might be saving someone's life or helping someone out in need. They don't do it because of money. But so the whole idea of the voluntary donation system is that by telling the truth, by giving to someone just because you want to help them, you're more likely to be honest about your health history, right? Mm-hmm. Well, of course, the Australian Red Cross and the CSL ripped up all of those wonderful safety elements by sending blood vans to prisons. And countries like Canada in the 1970s were telling Australia, don't do that, for goodness sake, it's too dangerous. First of all, the prisoners don't tell the truth about their health histories, about whether they've been a drug user, about whether they've got hepatitis, about whether they've practiced unsafe sex, all of those sorts of things. And yet they might have also been donating blood because of incentives. Maybe they were given incentives to donate blood in prison, extra money for cigarettes or whatever it might be. These were not the right people to be taking blood from. And despite the good warnings of overseas countries, Australia just ignored them. And we continued to send these blood vans, and they were collecting, right up until the 1980s, they were collecting blood from prisoners.
So how did the blood contamination in Australia go on for so long?
It's a question that has every victim and loved one absolutely baffled. They knew that people were becoming infected with what they were calling non-A, non-B hepatitis. This is this lethal form of hepatitis that's now known as hepatitis C. They knew that was being transmitted to Australian patients in the 1970s. Their own documentation shows that. And yet they didn't warn anybody and they didn't do anything about it. There were things that could be done for hepatitis C before the advent of specific testing, which was in the 1990s. Australia in 1990 began screening for hepatitis C. And what they did was they made proud boasts. They said, oh, we were the second country in the world to use specific screening for hepatitis C in 1990. So it sounds like Australia did a wonderful thing. Well, of course, that was good PR, but it wasn't the actual truth. The truth was, when they said they brought in specific screening for hepatitis C in 1990, they gave the people the impression that positive blood, any positive donations that were found to be carrying the deadly hepatitis C virus would be discarded. Yeah, they misled the public. They weren't discarded at all. Basically, what they've done is they've decided, well, if we bring in screening for hepatitis C, we might lose 20% of our stock. So what we'll do is we'll actually exclude hepatitis C whole blood donations, but include hepatitis C plasma donations, which will be made into products for haemophiliacs.
Oh, it's just disgraceful.
So CSL were mixing foreign blood plasma into our supply and then passing it off as Australian blood. You know, how did 1,400 haemophiliacs get killed? Well, we're hearing from the Infected Blood Inquiry in the UK that they knew that you should not be importing American blood plasma into the UK because it was rife with hepatitis. It was criminals in jail. They should never use that blood. It would only lead to infections. And yet, years later, they introduced this factor VIII product in Australia with CSL mixing in foreign blood plasma from Southeast Asia, where they knew that hepatitis C was endemic. Oh, wow. You know, what a terrible thing. And that's why we're here today. We've only got 200 of the victims of CSL knowingly contaminating our blood supply left. We've had 1,400 brave, wonderful Australians die because of this. So it was Australia used the worst possible donors that one could ever use. And why we did that, goodness only knows. This is why we want to have a Royal Commission of Inquiry.
Oh boy, I can't wait for our next episode, Charles, when we talk about why. Why?
Yeah.
Stay tuned for that.
Yeah.